So in this video, we're going to lean a little heavier on the visual strategy component as opposed to the explicitly technical component, and I'll show you why. When I see students working on a complex piece like this, one of the big problems that they run into is what they choose to define as a shape. So it seems pretty obvious that you would want the entire outline of the skull to be a single shape, but where this starts to cause problems is if we zoom in, you'll see that right here, for example, we have this line that carries through the top of the jaw and the cheekbone and so forth, and then down along to the upper teeth. Now this is problematic because the way that we currently have it laid out, we'd sort of have to illustrate that line twice, right? Once to accomplish this, and then once to accomplish this. And illustrating something twice and trying to get them to line up exactly almost always causes pain down the line. So what we're going to do is shift over our approach from just a singular overall outline skull to one piece that identifies this area, but then cuts in and does the top teeth. And then there's going to be one piece that identifies the jaw, and then we're going to use the layers to lay one over the top of the other. So to do this, we'll have to break apart our existing line. So I'll take the pen and I'll hover down here. I want the break to be right around there. So I just want to hover down here and give myself an extra point. White arrow, click out here in neutral territory, and then I'll click on the offending line segment and delete it. So that just gives me, I basically was establishing the start and stop point for my deletion. Okay, and I'll do the same thing over here. I want to take a good look at this path, add in another point, A, deselect, reselect the segment, and cut it out. And in fact, on this one now, I'm just going to go ahead and you'll note that I had to deselect the line and reselect it so not all of the points were active at the same time. And now I can just kind of pull that up until it's closer to where I want it to be, because I'm going to have that line cut across like this. Okay, back to P for pen. And we can go in here, and this time around I'll show you what this is going to start to look like once you have a little bit more confidence. So now I can just hold the mouse and drag, and I don't necessarily need to worry about clicking and then coming back and modifying this later, because I'm just going to feel much more, well, I mean, I am going to modify it again in a certain way, but I'm not going to bother with that step where I make everything a corner point first. So I get something that kind of looks like that. Now, the reason that I'm just skimming across the top of the teeth and not really bothering with refinement is that for the most part, these teeth are visually identified by the fact that the tooth itself is projecting out in front of the jaw. So we're effectively going to take this upper piece, we're going to fill it with color like that, and then we would go above that thing, above that shape in the layers, and then lay an individual tooth on. So I'll show you what an example of that would look like. So here I can drop down this menu, I can hide that. Yeah, there's my lower path, okay. And then P for pen, and again I can get in here and then start to sort of identify what a tooth looks like. You know, trying to be pretty accurate, but changing the shape slightly when the visual suits me. So now I get a tooth that looks something like that, and I'm not yet working in realistic color, but I will start to need to diverge these colors just to see what I'm doing. So maybe I'll make this a little bit lighter, for example. And then now when I bring back up my background, I just made some random path there and I'll delete it. You can start to see what that's going to look like separate from the background image. So for whatever reason, and I think it just comes from being used to working in traditional media, a lot of people would choose to draw this where they would draw this line like this, but then they would come up and do that on their way across. And then they would try to draw the tooth, but they would try to illustrate that again. And then what you'll wind up with is two lines that are really close together, but not quite. There are ways to maximize that as a stylistic choice, but for the most part, that just looks like you don't really know what you're doing. So we want to take advantage of one of the simplest and most powerful parts of Illustrator, which is choosing whether an illustration, drops on the top or the bottom of a relationship with another visual piece. Once this starts to grow in complexity, you also might start to label these things. So here we have bottom of the jaw and top. Bottom and top are not going to last very long, right? We're going to have to make those most specific as we go. But we can do that by making lots of different top-level layers and saying, like, for example, I could make this and say, here's the top of the skull, The top of the skull contains this guy, for example. We could say here's the bottom of the skull. Now the fact that bottom contains bottom, not super useful, but we'll do more on that in a second. So the tooth is going to belong to the top layer, and we want it to be up above the top of skull so that we get that visual result that we're looking for. So I'll just trash the yellow layer, and then I'm starting to sort of make my layers more complex in this way. Now let's finish off the bottom real quick just so you can see where I'm going with this. So I'll bring the skull back up, I'll hide the top, go back to my pen tool, and make sure I have the right layer active. And now what I can do is I can just come way up into top skull territory, and I don't have to really worry about what that looks like up there, because again we'll be taking advantage of layer hierarchy. And so now I can just come down through, and you start getting into some choices about what's going to be in front and what's going to be in the back. So I think down here it's sort of half and half. Sometimes it's the tooth defining the edge, and sometimes it's not. I'm not paying too much attention here to what I'm doing. You'll notice that I'm skipping over this sort of shadowed part. I think I'm going to represent that in a different way later. And then we're going to get something like this. Okay, so we make that jaw. Let's flop that so it's a solid. And then we'll make that color something different just so that we can see it. Now we'll bring up the top and we'll hide the background. And so now you can see why these lines right here I didn't bother with too much, because they're really just there to get my graphic across the boundary. And then because we're making good use of layer hierarchy and so forth, we'll use that to reinforce this edge so we don't have to draw it twice.